could you just start off by stating your name and, the title I could use for you?
Sure. My name is Ted Rutland, and I'm an associate professor at Concordia University.
Thanks so much, Ted. So do you think Projet Montreal has properly served the people of Montreal during their last and so far their current term?
I think no. I mean, I think that might be a different answer in both cases. And so their first term in power, they did some really important things. They campaigned on the Pink Line. They campaigned on the Réseau Express Vélo, the REV. I think they did what they could on those things. They pushed ahead on the REV, which required a lot of ambition because it was a controversial project. I think that project, strengthened the bicycling system in Montreal in meaningful ways. And I applaud them for their courage in pushing forward on projects that are controversial but necessary for the quality of our life in the city and our ability to meet climate change targets. While they didn't achieve the Pink Line, everyone knew that wasn't going to be something that the city itself could fund. And so if they're committing to building a new metro line, that just means that they're going to fight really hard to get the funding from the provincial or the federal government. They didn't quite do that, but recently we've seen a commitment to significantly extend the Blue Line, which is good. There's discussion of a Rev de l'Est, which if properly designed, and currently it isn't properly designed, would serve a similar purpose to the Pink Line. And so in terms of the things that they campaigned strongly on, I think they did a good job. But we can see that, during the 4 years that of their first term, we also saw a massive gentrification process take place in many Montreal neighborhoods, escalating rents, escalating property values, thousands of rent evictions, lots of people displaced. And Projet Montreal did nothing on those things. And so they really pitched their entire housing program on building new social and affordable housing. And so what they did push through is the Règlement sur le métropole mixte, which requires developers of larger condo projects, and in fact, to some extent, all condo projects now, to contribute to social housing and to contribute in some specific cases to affordable housing. And that's a good policy that they passed. There are some issues with it, but it's a good policy. The issue is that even if that policy works to its full capacity, the amount of new social and affordable housing built each year will always be less than the amount of affordable housing that's destroyed through rent evictions and through gentrification. And so a good approach to housing in our time would involve both a commitment to building new social and affordable housing, but also a commitment to keeping the existing affordable housing in the city. And existing affordable housing, a lot of that includes just it's private, for-profit housing that happens to just have a relatively low rent because rents in Montreal have historically not been that high, because some of that housing is not located close to a metro station, some of it's not in good repair. But that's housing that we absolutely need to preserve, and they didn't do anything to preserve that in their first mandate. And then finally, they really sold us a bill of goods on reforming the police. So they came into power with a commitment to saying, we are going to examine police data on police stops by racial background. That will take a while. When we got that data, we will act on it. So they kind of sold us on a whole 4-year process of reform. They managed to sell some people on it. The process took a while. The data came out. The results were what most people who are paying attention expected, which is that the police are 4 times more likely to stop a Black or Indigenous person than a white person. They're 12 times more likely to stop an Indigenous woman than a white woman. So this confirms, what most people know. It confirms what research going back to the 1980s shows. And so then what do we do about it? And their solution to it was to introduce a policy on police stops that says that you can't just stop someone if you don't have any other reason to, but their racial background. You have to have a reasonable basis to stop them. But that's part of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada since the 1980s. It's also official SPVM policy since the 1980s. So all they did was pass a policy that reminds the police that they're supposed to follow the law. And so, I guess we'll see the new data next year and see if things have changed. I don't expect that they will. And of course, Projet Montreal was in power during the historic protests against police killings of unarmed Black people, against racial profiling, against police violence. They were in power when the vast majority of Montrealers, 73% of people, were in favor of defunding the police. And Projet Montreal increased the police budget in 2020, in 2021, and into the current moment. So that's their first term. When it comes to their second term, what did they campaign on? They campaigned on a housing policy that would commit to building new affordable housing, so not social housing. So affordable according to a particular definition, which is for-profit housing that's sold or rented for 10% lower than the market rents or property values in an area. It's a really good program. If they actually go through with implementing it, and it sort of seems that they will, it will create a lot of decent housing for middle-income people. It's a good thing. It addresses some of the housing needs of middle-class people. And there are housing needs for middle-class people, but they seem to have entirely abandoned their commitment to social housing because they didn't meet their targets in their first term. And now the Quebec government has canned all funding for social housing. So I don't see any indication that Projet Montreal will actually find a way to build social housing. They also campaigned on a rent registry or a lease registry. And we knew that was going to be a relatively weak policy. It was going to involve keeping track of the rents charged to tenants in buildings of 8 units or more. So already that's not going to be the greatest policy in the world because you're excluding anything less than 8 units. And a lot of Montrealers live in duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, fiveplexes, sixplexes, etc. So it wasn't a great policy. But it turns out in the implementation, it's even worse because they're only going to record the rent charged every 5 years. And so a lot can happen in those 5 years. It means that if you start renting an apartment, on the second year or the third year or the fourth year, the rent that was recorded in the system is going to be irrelevant to your capacity to fight at the Régie de Logement, what's now the Tribunal Administratif de Logement, for the legal rent level. So that doesn't work. And then finally, and this is my personal kind of area of focus, is they came out in front during the campaign, knowing that Denis Coderre and Ensemble Montréal were going to campaign on fear of gun violence, fear of gangs, and we're going to campaign on increased police funding. So Projet Montreal came out and announced their platform ahead of Denis Coderre and Ensemble Montréal, and they committed to what they called a balanced approach to public security. And so they did commit to increasing the SPVM budget by around $18 or $19 million a year. But they also committed to 2 other things that I think are actually really positive. They committed to a small increase in funding for community organizations that work to prevent violence, including gun violence. So they committed to doubling the budget from around $2.5 million to $5 million, which is nothing. It's not much, okay? But it's something. So we'll see how they did on that in a second. they also committed to expanding a really promising new program that was introduced in the fall of 2021. So the new program is called EMIS. It's a program where unarmed civilians respond to certain kind of situations where the police would normally be called. And so that could involve situations involving homeless people. It was billed as a program that could potentially respond to mental health crises, to drug overdoses, etc. And so this is a really positive pilot project. Cities across North America are looking at the kinds of calls that 911 receives and the police receive, thinking about whether the police need to be the person to respond to those. When they do that kind of reflection, they find that somewhere between 30 and 50% of calls that we dispatch to the police should be going to unarmed civilians who are actually trained to deal with things like homelessness, mental health crises, drug overdoses, etc. And I think that's a conservative estimate. I think we could up that to like 80% of calls, but 50% is already pretty good. So we have this little pilot project, just having unarmed civilians respond to certain kinds of calls in one borough. And Projet Montreal campaigned on extending that to all 19 boroughs and having it operate 24 hours a day. Okay, so now what have they done since coming to power? One is that we find that a lot of that $5 million that's supposed to go to community violence prevention isn't going to community violence prevention at all. It's going to a whole bunch of social programs that are really good, but that won't do anything to diminish violence. And so in Montréal Nord, there's $400,000 allocated under the community violence prevention program. Almost all of it is going to programs that have nothing to do with that. $200,000 of the overall budget is going to this SPVM convened community forum on gun violence, which is just a public relations exercise for the police, as well as an attempt to enforce on community organizations that they should partner with the police and that they should share information that they have with the police, which is an extremely damaging proposition that I hope community organizations will reject. But clearly the $200,000 that they've devoted to that isn't going to decrease violence, isn't going to help community organizations to fulfill their mandate. So it's a complete failure on that respect, even in relation to what Projet Montreal campaigned on. And then when it comes to this really promising program, EMIS, unarmed civilians responding to various kinds of situations, they didn't fund it. It's not the $3.75 million that they promised to devote to an expansion of this program was not in their 2022 budget. And now they're saying that they're going to ask the Quebec government for this money. So we're still in the situation where we have this tiny pilot project when we should be massively expanding that project and using police money to support it. Because really, and I'm taking a fairly liberal perspective here, every call that EMIS responds to is one less call the police have to respond to. So you can really easily fund this out of the police budget money. And so if you can't find the $3.75 million, well, the rest of us can find it. It's in the SPVM budget. And then finally, they said they were going to increase the police budget by $18 or $19 million. Instead, they increased it by $45 million, which is the second largest increase in the history of Montreal and the largest budget increase anywhere in Canada in 2022. So their so-called balanced approach to public security turned out to be an extremely unbalanced approach, emphasizing enormously the police to solve every kind of problem of insecurity and lack of safety that exists in the city, when everybody now, I think, understands that the least we can say is that the police are not the response to all issues. I think that we could work towards a world where the police aren't the response to any issues, but in the short term, we could at least admit there's a whole lot of work that the police do that would be better done by other kinds of services.
Thank you so much. That answered quite a few things I was going to ask, so that helps.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, so you did touch on this, but you touched on it a lot, but I kind of want to ask again just to get into a little bit more. Does Projet Montreal provide an unnecessary focus on the notion that crime is increasing in our city?
They do. I mean, so in the election campaign, we had Denis Coderre and Ensemble Montréal campaigning on the idea that Montreal is no longer a safe city. Projet Montreal said it is a safe city, and they said, that to say otherwise is to insult the really hard work that police are doing to keep our city safe. Okay, so they say that this city is safe, but nevertheless, they continue to talk about this vast, unprecedented increase in gun violence in the city. And it's absolutely not the case that gun violence is unprecedented. Until very recently, we didn't have any figures that showed any kind of increase at all. Gun crime in Montreal was actually down through 2020 and most of 2021, all the while that Projet Montreal, the SPVM, the Police Fraternité, and the media are claiming that it's out of control. And then finally, we did have a small increase in certain kinds of gun crime in 2021. So the facts finally confirmed what people had been saying falsely for a year and a half prior to that. But even then, it's not without precedent. It's about the same level of gun violence we had 10 or 15 years ago. And so, and I think that what does it do to exaggerate the level of crime, violence, and gun crime in particular in the city? I mean, it's not a problem to say that violence and gun crime are problems, because they really are. I mean, one murder is too many murders. One life lost is too many. We need to do something about that. And so I'm not opposed to the idea of bringing attention to this, because these lives matter to people, and we should continually be striving for a city, without violence at all. But if you exaggerate the extent of it, it makes it seem like it's urgent. We have to act now. And every time that we say that something is urgent and we have to act now, the only solution seems to be more police. Because we're always told that police can solve the thing in the short term, that community investments can solve things in the long term. But the truth is that, first, when we say, community investments are the long-term thing, what actually happens is we never make those investments. So we always make those urgent, short-term police investments, and then, attention turns elsewhere, and we never make the investments in community programs, in social programs that actually address the root causes of violence, insecurity, marginalization. And the other thing is, community investments in community programs can achieve results just as fast as the police. It's not like the police, have a list of people who are preparing to murder people, and they just need the resources to go out and arrest them. They have to do long-term investigations. They have to cultivate relationships with informers. They have to and getting informers means you have to make a lot of arrests for low-level crimes and then make deals with people you've arrested so they'll give you information. All of that's super long-term. And so it's really false to try to whip people into a frenzy and pretend that we're dealing with an unprecedented problem, because that leads automatically to a solution, which is increasing police resources and policing, which doesn't address the problem in the short term and worsens the problem in the long term, because policing aggravates the conditions that lead to violence and most forms of crime in general. And I think that's pretty actually well understood.
Is there anything more you want to say on the landlord registry and just housing in general?
I think one of the things I think we need to recognize is that Projet Montreal, since coming to power in their first term, has banked everything on this Règlement pour la Métropole Mixte, which is forcing developers to include social and affordable housing in new constructions. And with the announcement by the provincial government, the CAQ, that they're no longer going to fund the social housing program Accès Logis, effectively that policy does nothing. So Montreal does not have a program to expand social housing right now. And that's a complex problem for a city government to address, because historically social housing is funded by the provincial government. But there are lots of other ways to ensure that this is a livable city for everyone. And so I think it's really important that people understand that we don't have a policy right now and that demand that Projet Montreal do everything in their power, including protecting existing affordable housing, to ensure that this place is still relatively affordable for a large number of people 4 years from now.
Thank you so much, Ted. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you want to talk about or expand on at all?
I can say something and you can use it or not, but I mean, so I'll say it. It's like one of the things that I've observed by looking at debates about public security and about policing across Canada is that Montreal is basically the only large city in Canada, and by large city I'm thinking all the way down to cities of like 500,000 people, where there isn't a single voice on city council who's in favor of defunding the police, and that is a result of a few things. One is that Montreal is one of only two large cities in Canada that has municipal political parties. Vancouver is the other one, but Vancouver has a few more parties, including one genuinely left-wing party, COPE. Montreal has political parties, and we kind of only have two parties. Projet Montreal, which positions itself as progressive but isn't, and then Ensemble Montréal, which is always the greater evil. And so there aren't voices outside of those two formations that can potentially be more accountable to their constituents and speak for what constituents actually want. And the other is, I know there are representatives of Projet Montreal who sit on city council who are in favor of defunding the police, but they will never be allowed to say that out loud. They will never be able to vote on it because they have to vote along party lines. And so we have a massive muzzling of any kind of progressive voice in Montreal, which comes from the fact that Projet Montreal has basically occupied everything from the center right to the left of the political spectrum, and made sure that if you're a progressive and you want to run for city council and get elected, you have to join Projet Montreal. But once you're elected, you can't voice progressive concerns anymore, except about things like bike lanes and public transportation, which I think are really important, but don't necessarily address the core issues of like working class people, poor people, of racialized people in our city. So they're good things, but I don't think they're necessarily they're certainly not enough to constitute a progressive agenda, and I'm not even totally sure that they are progressive policies, even though I think they're positive.
Do you know if there's a how do I word it? Counselors and any party members, are they specifically banned, or is it just something within party politics where they kind of have to have like I'm sorry, I'm struggling to vocalize this. I'm just trying to address why I mean, of course, I'll reach out to Projet Montreal myself, but not that they ever really give me an interview. But I'm just trying to understand why they won't let anyone in the party who agrees with defunding to be outspoken about it.
So I don't know. I don't know how formal it is. So are people told, like, they consistently vote along party lines. They never do otherwise. And if they do otherwise, then they end up leaving the party. Christian Arsenault voted against his own party last term once, and then he left the party and sat as an independent. He and three other Projet Montreal people were in favor of defunding the police. Sue Montgomery, Juliana Fumigali, and a woman in Montreal now, I can't remember her name right now, but they all were pushed out of the party, and the rationale is not that. It's that they were like cantankerous. They were like not very diplomatic. They were abusive, is often the term that's used to talk about Sue Montgomery and Juliana Fumigali. And I'm in no position to say that they weren't. I just think it's interesting that if people develop an independent viewpoint within the party, they end up not in the party anymore.